So this week we're going to switch from discussing articles essentially outlining ethical theories to applied topics within ethics. And when we cover applied topics, I'll do my best to provide at least some brief lecture that provides a general overview of the topic, as well as giving us some concrete examples to think about as we go through the articles. This playlist collects and organizes the segments of the lecture that introduce the notion of rights and discrimination in preparation for looking at Feinberg's article on the nature and importance of rights and Singer's article on the nature and moral repulsiveness of discrimination. I'll start off by talking about the two general theoretical notions of rights that have figured in particularly Western culture and governance. So we'll talk about natural rights and we'll talk about civil rights. Then we'll look at a specific case of the slow but steady movement towards women's suffrage. That is, the encoding in civil law the right for women to vote. Now, voting isn't a direct natural right, even on Hobbes's view, but it is a sort of correlate or a means of implementing a natural right. Recall that all governments for Hobbes gain their legitimacy exhaustively and exclusively through consent of the governed. So we'll look at the development of women's suffrage worldwide, and then we'll focus our attention on the development of women's suffrage in the United States. After that, we'll turn to a very, very brief history of the rise of Jim Crow laws, that is, laws that emerged after the 1870s that sought to discriminate and or segregate people on the basis of their ethnicity. And then we'll talk about civil rights laws, which sought at the federal level primarily to render the ability of individual states, counties, cities to pass such laws impossible. So we'll start off talking about the emergence of these sorts of discriminatory laws, which sought to deny certain members of society their rights, sought to separate certain members of society from other members of society. And I'll talk about the pervasiveness of these kinds of laws, much wider than oftentimes people associate with the term Jim Crow law. We'll look at some early reversals, that is, rulings against such laws within the U.S. federal judicial system. And then finally, we'll look at laws that were passed in the late 50s and early 60s that largely managed to render such discriminatory laws illegal at the federal level. So theorists usually characterize natural rights as universal, unconditioned, exceptionless rights. These rights are discovered through reason, and they are part of the natural moral order. The normative force flows from God, the nature of rationality, and so on. The notion of natural rights dates back probably to Aristotle and the Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece, so somewhere around 350 to 300 years BCE, before the Common Era. The notion of natural rights figures in thinking in the Roman Empire and in the Middle Ages. However, it wasn't until the Renaissance and the Enlightenment that natural rights rose to prominence as a basis for legitimate government and a basis for criticizing the legitimacy of governance in Western cultures in Europe. Now, some scholars claim that the concept of natural rights predates these thinkers in ancient Greece. For instance, some scholars point to Cyrus the Great, who ruled the Persian Empire and lived from 600 to 530 before the Common Era. In 539 BCE, Cyrus conquered Babylon, and in 1879, archaeologists found the Cyrus cylinder, an inscribed clay cylinder created on Cyrus's orders in the ruins of ancient Babylon. Now, some scholars claim that the cylinder includes statements about natural rights. However, many scholars reject a rights interpretation of the cylinder, and it's the claim of these scholars that it represents the earliest known instance of abdication of natural rights is highly contentious. The notion of civil rights refers to rights granted by governments to their citizens, though theorists see civil and natural rights as distinct. In practice, many seeming natural rights, for instance the right to liberty, appear in various declarations of civil rights, like the U.S. Declaration of Independence. However, the scope of civil rights tend to extend beyond potential natural rights, and their codification proves much more variable across different societies. So, for example, the right to bear arms, as stated in the U.S. Constitution and interpreted by the U.S. judicial system, is not widely recognized as a civil right in other modern industrialized countries. Now, the notion of civil rights actually figures in charters that granted civil rights before people like Hobbes and periods like the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The earliest governing charters that granted civil rights include the Edict of Milan, which granted a certain amount of religious freedom to Christians within the Roman Empire, Muhammad's Constitution of Medea, which granted rights to subjects when Muhammad moved to the capital in 1622 after the Common Era, and the English Magna Carta, which was written by nobles and signed by Henry III in 1215 AD. However, the notion of civil rights doesn't really rise to prominence in Western culture until the rise of social contract theory and the general movement towards more democratic societies during the 17th through the 19th centuries. And this period saw the creation and ratification of many declarations of rights, including the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution.